Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Trask. You've probably heard much too much from me at this point. I'm taking my Congress chair hat off and I'm putting on my sponsor hat, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here, and I'm very proud and pleased to sponsor this session, Rahul. Arts Marketing has been a sponsor of Congress for 20 years. We, aside from KCI, are the other inaugural Congress sponsor, and we're very proud to do that and to be here today. It's my privilege to, as your sponsor, to introduce our speaker today. Rahul, as you know, is the president and CEO of the Toronto Community Foundation and has been working to engage philanthropy in Toronto and to improve our city. He serves on a wide range of boards and is currently the chair of the Community Foundations of Canada and vice chair of George Brown College. He's a former member of the board of Toronto Downtown Jazz Festival, the United Way Toronto, and the Toronto Port Authority and the Stratford Festival. Formerly a corporate lawyer with a leading Canadian law firm. Oh, I just got louder. With a leading Canadian law firm, Rahul was also vice president of the Toronto 2008 Olympic bid, chair of the 2012 Ontario Summer Games, and is currently co-chair of TO 2015 Ignite, a program of the Toronto 2015 Pan American Games. Rahul's presentation, which is a part of AFP's Diversity to Inclusion series today, will be about 45 minutes, and about 45 minutes long. And then Rahul's going to be joined by our chapter's president, Susan Story, and Susan is going to moderate an engaging dialogue and discussion for the second half of today. So without further ado, I say welcome, Rahul.
The outline for today was really about city building and philanthropy and connecting the two together. So as you heard, we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to explain a little bit about how we connect the two together, why that's so important for particularly our foundation, why that's critically important for engaging philanthropists as we're experiencing these days. Go for about half hour, 40 minutes, see where we end up, and then we're going to sit down and do a little bit of a Q&A. So feel free to throw any questions out there. In the course of doing this, we're going to go through a very interesting tour of Toronto from the comfort of your seats. And at the end, I'm going to bring it back, and I'm going to really bring that back into philanthropy. But I'll set the context through our tour of Toronto. But I do want to start out with the ultimate question that we tend to get asked, and I'm sure many of you as fundraising professionals do as well. When you're going to solicit a donor, you're having a chat, ultimately the question comes up, what's the money going to be used for, right? What are you going to do with the money? And that's absolutely been a key question for us at the Toronto Foundation as well. And through that, we've built a model of philanthropy that works very well for our foundation. Other community foundations are certainly picking it up. And it's gone so far as when I was down in the States last year where they actually coined it the Toronto model of philanthropy, and many of their foundations as funders are picking up on that. So I'm going to introduce you to that a little bit as well. Many of you have in front of you our Toronto's Vital Signs report. Just to give you a little bit of a flavor, this is one of the newspaper versions of the report. If you're a real data hound, there's 300 pages report online with full text, hypertext links. There's a full microsite where it's all broken down as well. So if you really, really love your city and you really want to know about it, you can go online and you're going to find out a great deal about it. Now, the important thing about Vital Signs, and I'm going to get to how it fits into our strategy, is a little bit of a personal learning journey as well. I always call it an important story about Toronto for Toronto, but what it really is a civic engagement tool that we've leveraged to create a real philanthropic movement in the city. Now, many of you might not know about this, but how many of you Torontonians? Okay, fair number, great. Remember those good old days called pre-amalgamation, right? So about 15 years ago by now, it was amalgamation time, and some local luminaries got together and said, you know, there's something really unique about our city that's going to change as a result of amalgamation. Let's grab that narrative, let's measure it, and let's measure the change over time. And that's what actually gave birth to Toronto's Vital Signs. And when I came on board, it was about 2,500 circulation that went out as an annual report. And we said, you know what, this is too important a story about Toronto for Toronto. We went to our newspaper partner, The Star, who didn't know me from Adam at the time. And I said, look, you've got to do something important about this. Let's take it out and let's get the whole city on the same page at least one day a year. So hence, when you open that up, you'll see it on one page, and that's quite deliberate. And that's probably the single biggest fight I had with the Star, when they kept saying it can't be done on a page. And I said, don't lose the symbolic nature of that being on one page. So now we've been doing this for about 13 years. It went from a circulation of about 2,500 to 400,000 to now over 1 million people in the city of Toronto are now actively engaged with vital signs and learning about their city. Do you recall this year we had another initiative called the Night of 1,000 Dinners? Does that ring a bell? Anybody here host a dinner or go to one of the dinners? That's too bad, because you really should next time. There's a remarkable thing that's happening in the city of Toronto. And that is, on that night, there were 1,000 dinners. I think we got over 500, but the concept was 1,000 dinners that were hosted by Torontonians. They would take this report, invite guests to their home or go to a restaurant, and in this very important year of an election year with all the funny stuff going on at City Hall, they sat down and they talked about their city. And they talked about it from a common knowledge base. So this is a really neat way to start to build civic engagement. And as a result of that, they were able to take some questions, have some common themes to talk about, and finally feed them into us. And myself and Matt Galloway at CBC hosted a mayoral election, all based on our community's assessment and understanding of what Toronto's vital signs said to them. So it was an exceptionally interesting start. But everything for us starts at vital signs. So I want to take you through a little bit about this, about the report itself. Now, if you're anything like me, you'll know this city largely is a function of where you live and where you work and what you see in between. Right? We're 2.7 million people in a region of just about 6 million. This is a big place to get your arms around. So this report is an attempt to really bridge that gap and get people to understand other parts of the city so they can start to impact it. And from a philanthropic standpoint, it's all about knowledge and getting that knowledge into philanthropists' hands. Now, to make a little bit more of a point about the notion of how people know their city, I happen to live in the beach. Anybody here live in the beach or anywhere near it? Everybody knows where the beach is, I'm guessing by now, right? So when I first moved there, I used to go down on the boardwalk in the morning, on a Saturday morning. And it's quite an idyllic little spot, right? You see golden retrievers, Birkenstock, Starbucks. It's a Freedom 55 commercial going on down there. You come back at the end of the day, and you'll see that all of the newcomers are getting off on the buses. They're going down onto the sand. They're actually the only ones who are swimming, which is hard to believe, and I'll explain why in a minute. And you'll have different clothing and you'll have different food from all over the world. And it struck me at how remarkable that was, that there's having really two cities, but in the same space and time. And somehow this narrative that we call vital signs really pulls all that stuff together. So as I said, by bringing it together, that creates the strategic guide for what we do at our foundation. So the Toronto Foundation, formerly the Toronto Community Foundation, is now one of 191 community foundations across the country that are more and more using knowledge as a base to gain engagement with philanthropists in our community. So when people at our foundation ask me, what do you do? It's fundamentally, we are a knowledge company in the philanthropic sector. So we leverage this knowledge not only to leverage giving, but more importantly, to leverage giving, align it with a fact base to actually develop outcomes and impact that's measurable. So that's the model that we start talking about more and more. Now, it's a critically important model, as I found out a couple of years ago in particular. I was in Brazil. I was invited to talk about Toronto's vital signs in Brazil at Sao Paulo. And when I got down there, I said to them, so seriously, why did you invite me from Toronto, this little foundation, to come to Brazil to talk about philanthropy? So after a couple of days, somebody finally warmed up and they said to me, he said, Rahul, you have to understand, in Brazil, charity is the church and philanthropy is tax evasion. And I said, well, that's an interesting way to look at it. So suddenly this Canadian model actually provided this space where they could come together to develop more and new innovative solutions. So when I left Brazil, I reminded them that in Toronto, and particularly at our foundation, where most philanthropists think about the money, right? Philanthropy is about cutting checks. Said, no, not where we come from, and not in our foundation. For us, philanthropy is the space that brings the public sector and the private sector together to develop innovative solutions to wicked problems. Now, I've been dining out on that phrase for a while because it's actually quite an engagement journey. And in a couple of minutes, I'm going to introduce you to how we've actually brought philanthropists into that dialogue, not about the money, but coming into a space of risk and innovation to help develop some very interesting solutions to what's going on in their city and the communities they really care about. So as you know, every year when we launch the report, we do a big launch down at the Canadian Club, and you have to take this 300-page report and boil it down to something that's digestible. So this year I started, and I reminded everybody that the big uber theme to understand Toronto this year is that old saying about why did the Canadian cross the road, right? To get to the middle. And the whole point being is that, you know, standing in the middle anymore in Toronto, that lovely middle of the road city, isn't going to cut it anymore, right? We've got some really good things happening on, but some really burning issues. We can't afford to be stuck in the middle any longer. So then we came up with the tagline of, "It's about time." And if you look at the cover of the report in front of you, you'll see what looks like a bat signal. And I'm guessing most of the folks in this room have a sense of what a bat signal is. When I was at U of T and I was talking about the bat signal, they looked at me like I was a lunatic. They were too young. Nobody had ever seen Batman, so they didn't know. But the idea is that it's about time for Torontonians to urgently stand up and start to impact and get engaged with their city because they love their city and because it's worth loving. And I'm going to explain that in a little bit more detail. So when we say it's about time, that's got a whole bunch of meanings to it. First of all, we say it's about time we stopped wondering whether we are a world-class city. Because in fact, not only we are a world-class city, we are at the top of that class. I'm going to take you through a couple numbers to give you an idea about that. There are about 500 cities on the planet with over 1 million people in it. And for the 6th year in a row, Toronto was number 4 on that list. 4th most livable city on the planet, according to The Economist. This is a remarkable, remarkable accomplishment, not to mention it's 6 years in a row. But here's another takeaway. 3 out of the 5 top cities on that list are Canadian. Vancouver, Toronto, and Calgary. And if you take away anything today, just remind yourself that if this was sports, that would be 3 on the first-class team on the planet, on the first all-star team on the planet. This country has got some of the best standard of living anywhere out there, and we're blessed to be in a city that's number 4 on the list. So let's dive in and try to figure out a little bit more about why that's the case. So when people start to think about livability in a city, first thing they go to, how safe is it? Now, if you watch CP24, you might have some questions about what's really going on in the city. But the truth of the matter is, once again, we are one of the safest of the 33 metros in Canada, which means we're one of the safest large cities on the planet. Crime is down by 7% again last year in the region, and it's a continuing decline that's going down. Everybody looks at the homicide rate, which is very, very troubling. And you know in pockets of the city it's extremely problematic. But once again, last year we had 57 homicides, which is 1 more than the year before, but it's still below the 10-year average of 63. So we're actually doing quite good when it comes to the safety issue here. Now, when we start to talk about crime statistics too, we often look south of the border. And when we look south of the border, you look at comparable cities. And when you look at a comparable city in the States, often show up with Chicago, right? On a lake, big city around the same province, same size as Toronto, kind of crazy mayoral situation down there from time to time. But people think of us as the same. 57 homicides in Toronto. Last year they had a banner year in Chicago at 415. That was the lowest since 1965. So when you start to think about what's going on in terms of crime in the city, that's one indicator that's actually really starting to look positive. When we start to look at some of the other things that people don't ordinarily consider about livability is the greening of our city. I started a conversation a few minutes earlier about the beach where I happen to live. Well, if you go down Ashbridges Bay, you're going to see a huge flag there. It's a blue flag. That tells us that that's one of the safest clean water beaches on the planet, a blue flag designation. Now, we've got 11 beaches in the city of Toronto. I don't know if you knew we had 11 of them. And 8 out of those 11 are blue flag beaches. And blue flag is a designation that some of the most famous beaches on the planet do not have. So we're actually quite blessed to be there. Now, one of the aha moments for myself, again, came up this year in the report when I found out that over 50% of Torontonians live within 500 meters of one of Toronto's 1,600 parks. Who knew we had 1,600 parks? So we've actually got quite a greening trend taking place in Toronto, which is something to be quite pleased about. One of the other sort of epiphanies around that space that I didn't realize until I read the report this year is now when you go on College Street during rush hour, now if you're driving, this isn't going to make you happy, but there are 150,000 cyclists in the city of Toronto, and on College Street in rush hour, there are more cars than bikes now. So we're actually starting to turn the corner quite away from a city and a region that was built on the auto industry. And that's not a criticism. That's, in fact, a great fact. But we've actually made quite a shift, and now we're turning into, slowly but surely, a cycling community. So we're cleaner and greener. Crime's kind of going down. Economy sort of going uppish. Not too bad. We've got 147 high-rises under construction in the city. I mean, every time you drive down a garden or something new's popping up, right? They're just shooting out of the ground now. That's more than any other city in North America. So we're actually growing. Now, it's a whole different question about do we have the services there, and we can touch on that a little later. But right now, that's a really good indicator of some growth. When we start looking at the region itself and tourism, we're up about $2 billion in tourist economy-driven growth compared to what we were about 2 years ago. So all in all, it starts to look actually pretty good. Cost of doing business. We are amongst the lowest of 36 of the largest North American cities, and we're probably amongst the cheapest right now to start a business. So when you start hearing the narrative about we need to keep our taxes low to keep business attracted to the city, we've been there a long time now. It's really starting to pay off. We're in actually rather good shape then. We start to look at some other things then. So if you've got a pretty clean city and you've got a low crime city and you've got some great opportunities through the economy, well, guess what? You've got a lot of talent that you're able to draw on as well. And I just want to put some of that in context too. Then in the year 2000, 69% of high school kids were graduating from high school in the TDSB. 69%. Now that's actually gone up to 83%. So we're actually starting to get a cohort of youth going through one of the best education systems in the world, and they're actually doing extremely well in terms of the graduation rate now, comparatively. I can also tell you one other thing that if you're Torontonian, you may not flinch at, but it's an extremely important thing. We are officially 51% foreign-born in the city. 51% of the residents living in the city of Toronto were not born in Canada. So the way this has grown over the past couple of years in diversity, it's become so commonplace in the city that I can say it to you and there's not a gasp in the room. Everybody assumes it's already happened. I can also tell you this, that by the year 2025, 63% of Torontonians will be visible minorities. So several years ago when we launched our vital signs, the tagline was, "The world needs Toronto to succeed." And a part of the reason I said that is that we are literally a petri dish for globalization. Right? The whole world is in this city. And we're doing a darn good job of it as well. The other part of that the world needs Toronto to succeed was to say, if we can't get it right, I'm not sure who can get it right. So we need to really demonstrate some leadership in what we can do. So we talked about, it's about time. It's about time we start to recognize we're doing all these good things. But then there's the other notion of time too, right? This time. It's about lost time. It's about wasted time. And it's about the lost opportunities that come along with that. And I want to touch on those for a minute. So when we start to think about lost time, the first thing that comes to mind is, we can all groan, traffic, right? It's not getting better. We all know that. But I'm going to give you a little order of magnitude on how it's not getting better. We're the 15th amongst 22 global cities for the longest commute time. We're number 2 in North America, right behind New York City. So all the stuff that you're seeing out there, yeah, it's for real. It's not getting better. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of plans between the province, the feds, and the city that we've been talking about. Metrolinx is making some great moves in this respect, but it's going to take some time. But it's not only the lost productivity that's gone along with that too, but the commute time is also having a negative health effect on many Torontonians. So if you live downtown, you're twice as likely to walk or take public transit. If you live in the suburbs, you're a third more likely to have diabetes or be obese. So those health determinants are really starting to show up now. I did a call-in show not too long ago on Talk 1010, and this issue came up, and a very interesting gentleman phoned in and said a little story that really stuck in my mind about the negative effects of transit. And he said he's got an hour a day that he's got to do to work and an hour coming back from work. And he said, in his words, I'm a big boy. I can deal with this. But the problem is I don't get home till 7:30. So I can't take my little kid to hockey practice. So my kid's not playing hockey this year. So you could start to see that the stress is not just about the adults who are going back and forth from work, although that's extremely problematic, but the secondary and tertiary effects are starting to really play themselves out as well, and they're quite problematic. Time. How about time for young people? And when I mean that, I'm talking about youth unemployment in the city, about wasted time. When you go back to about 2008, just coming out of the last recession, we hit youth unemployment of about 11%. Then we went up a couple of years ago to about 18%. Right now in this city, we're sitting at 20% in youth unemployment. And if you're a newcomer, immigrant youth, it's 27%. We're starting to actually get into some European numbers in terms of youth unemployment in the city. It's highly, highly problematic. And for years, people have been saying to me, boy, we really need some strategies to deal with the issue of growing youth unemployment before it becomes a problem. And when you look at the numbers now, the issue is it's not what we're becoming, it's what we have become. And from that perspective, the real troubling number to me is we've been over 15% youth unemployment for a decade already. So this is something that's really growing. And you can imagine, though, too, that these are young people who've gone through the best education system in the Western world. And we say that you can come out there with A's, but you don't get a job. And this is getting problematic. It's only going to get worse if you look at the numbers out there right now. Another issue around lost time, too, is affordable housing. We've got 90,000 households in the city of Toronto that are waiting for affordable housing, and it's going to take them about 6 years. So that's close to 200,000 people who are going to be waiting for rent geared to income, because we are amongst the most severely unaffordable housing cities in the world. Number 1 and 2, Hong Kong and Vancouver, and we come in the 30s. So as you can tell, we've got some real pressing issues that we've got to get dealing with. And when you start to combine some of these, like youth unemployment and the unaffordability of housing in particular, you start ending up with some really skewed numbers around things like child poverty. And it's been in the news a lot lately, but when you start to think about Toronto as literally the richest city and one of the richest countries in the world, and we've got 29% of the children in the city of Toronto living below the low-income cutoff line, so they're living in poverty. You go to 14 neighborhoods in this city, and that number is from 40 to 50%. So we're starting to create a complete lost childhood for quite a number of children in this city. Sobering, isn't it? Right? On the one hand, we've got this phenomenal city, and on the other hand, we've got one where not enough people are living in that fourth most livable city on the planet. So when we start talking about this notion of poverty too, and it's something that I explain quite a bit to our donors when we're talking about the whole engagement journey and starting to understand the city, the numbers mean one thing, but I try to paint another picture. And I'm going to paint that picture for you now. Most people, when they think of poverty, the first thing they do is they think about money. And I'm going to just tell you a little story that may change your view on what we're really thinking about when we're talking about poverty in the city of Toronto. Now, many of you have heard of Jane Finch, I'm guessing, right? How many of you have actually been to Jane Finch? That's good. You're an honest group. So the last time I had this conversation with people, I had one person who put up their hand who'd actually been there. Because if you've actually been to Jane Finch, it's the cross-section of two really big streets up in the northwest end of the city. It's quite lively. They've got some phenomenal neighborhoods around there. They've got a whole bunch of issues as well, but they've got quite a dynamic neighborhood of a lot of newcomers that go there. There's a mall on the southeast corner, and downstairs in that mall it's like a warren of offices, really. It's quite a unique thing to see. And they have a lot of youth workers that are there. So several years ago, I was invited by some youth workers to come in to talk to them. We had a vital signs talk, and then a Q&A session. And there were probably, I don't know, about 75 folks in the room, probably, give or take, 40 women and maybe 35 fellas. And they're all from the Afro-Caribbean community, because that's what that neck of the woods is all about. And we talked about vital signs. And then afterwards, all the guys are looking at the floor. They don't want to meet you in the eyes. The women, they're right up there, and they want to have a chat about what's going on in their community. And this one woman, she just screamed out at me. She said, "We've got a problem with the men in our community." And I got really scared. I thought, this is going to go sideways. I'm going to be running for the door. And all the guys just looked like that. And I said, well, what's the problem? And she says, you know, we don't have leaders and mentors in our community. And we went on and on through this discussion that ended up with this remarkable punchline, though, that I'll never forget. She said, you know what? We know how to get rich in our community. We don't know how to get private school rich, which led to a remarkable conversation about the fact that they work hard, they go to school hard, they hold down jobs, 1 or 2. Their parents often have 2 and 3 jobs. And they don't have the networks, they don't have the ability to break out of the cycle that they're in. And what I took away from that was that if education is a hammer and it never meets its nail, which is opportunity, you get a whole bunch of really frustrated people. And if you ever want to really appreciate the divide that's taking place in our very good city of Toronto between the downtown and the inner suburbs that we're talking about, it is about poverty, and it's about the poverty of opportunity. It's about the gap in opportunity that's being created in that city. And a lot of what we do at our foundation is working to help ameliorate that poverty of opportunity and work on that gap. That's where we bring our donors into the conversation, and that's how we bring them through the conversation through our vital signs report. Now, I want to give you a couple of examples of how we do that. Not surprisingly, when you think of the big issues in the city, the ones folks want to look at are transit, they want to look at affordable housing, they want to look at youth unemployment, but boy, oh boy, do they ever want to look at young people and focus on giving them really good opportunities for their future. So I want to focus on a couple of these because this is where we find it to be the most fertile ground to engage donors. Because we find that to really fulfill our mission, we can't do it on our own by just cutting up checks. That's not what this is about. This is about engaging fund holders and donors, whether they be corporate, whether they be individuals, and actually bring them into this story about their community and engage them in programs and engage them in granting and literally connect their head with their heart. So now they've actually got a purpose in doing this. 2 programs I want to highlight for you because you can get a little bit of a flavor for it, because they all go back to vital signs. So several years ago, there was a lot of youth violence that was going on. Do you remember a year, the summer of the gun? Remember that became a phrase several years ago? Well, when we find something like that that pops out at us through our vital signs report, and it gets a label like that, we know there's youth violence, it's rising, we will go and convene the community. So we went and convened the Afro-Caribbean community, largely around Jane Finch, to say, let's do something about this. And they were called the Community Safety Dialogues. And literally asked the community, you tell us, what can we do to help? And the picture that was painted at that time was young men and women coming out of high school, at the end of the day. Dad and mom, they're not home, they're working 2 or 3 jobs. The brothers and sisters, they're doing the same thing and trying to do whatever they can do. So the kid comes out of school, look to your right, there's nobody home. Look to your left, what's waiting for you? Whole bunch of bad influence gang guys. So we needed to create an alternative path for them. And that path, we decided, through consultation with them, was going to be through sports and through leadership. So out of this was born this idea of the Toronto Sport Leadership Program. And the upshot of this was literally that we provided certification for training as sports lifeguards, soccer coaches, basketball coaches to these young people. They would get national level certification. And through that, they could get jobs through Parks and Rec. So literally, we sat down with one of our fund holders and we had a long conversation about the type of outcomes we were looking for and to get their support. And they immediately made the connection with vital signs, made the connection with Summer of a Gun, and made the connection with we need to do something innovative, and we understand it's risky, but there's $250,000. Let's go validate it, because if this works, we're going to get more people on board. We took that down to the United Way. We had another donor that they came forward with that doubled it up. Went to the City of Toronto and said, look, if these kids actually become lifeguards, will you hire them? They said, we're looking for it. We're dying for them. Let's get them going over here. Go to Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment. They open up their facilities. The 2 school boards, the Y brought their training fees down. As you can tell, before you know it, you've got this enormous convening capability of different partners, corporate, private, and public sector. We brought them all together, and off you go with the Toronto Sport Leadership Program. We're now into its 8th year, and we've had over 1,000 kids go through there, and you've got over 80% of them have got at least double certification, national level, and about the same number have got jobs through Parks and Rec. So when we go back to our donors and we can talk to our donors about the engagement journey they've gone through and the outcomes they're looking for, here for a fairly nominal amount for them compared to what they're doing in some other spaces, they have validated a model. It's not a rocket science model either. Half of us that played after-school sports when we were kids knew or know how important that was, particularly in high school. It's just not out there in the same way right now. So we had to recreate that model, and I'm very happy to say that that worked extremely successfully. One of the other ones that I want to share with you as well is a little bit more timely because it relates to the Pan Am Games. And once again, this is how you take a report. This is how you take a very esoteric piece of data in the report. This is how you create a narrative around that data that's real so people can touch and feel it. And this will be a story about how you can engage donors on the journey of, once again, building that out into an innovative program right around city building. So the idea was several years ago in our vital signs report, there was a diminished sense of belonging. So in the same neighborhoods that I've been talking to you about in terms of the poverty, the youth unemployment, not surprisingly, you've got a diminished sense of belonging. And I'm going to go down here for just a moment. In these neighborhoods, you can go there and talk to the adults who've come from other countries, and they're quite comfortable. You know, they're saying in the sense of, look, we've got some shelter, we got a job, can deal with that. I know I was an architect in Egypt, but I can't be one here. I'm not thrilled about it, but for my children's sake, because they can go to university, I'm okay with it. So their sense of belonging to be Canadian, not too bad. You talk to their kids, not so good, right? Second generation, visible minority youth. Why? They've all gone to Waterloo Engineering, but they have a different type of sounding name and they can't get a job. They're coming up against what they see as a glass ceiling. So we see this diminished sense of belonging in second generation youth as a real issue. Now, those of you who are students of this space at all might remember Robert Putnam. Does that ring a bell out there at all? Wrote this book called Bowling Alone. Now, if you haven't read this book, I strongly recommend at some point you have a look at it. Here's my little teaser on it. Everybody see the Flintstones at some point in their life, right? So when Fred and Barney are, let's say, with the volunteer fire department in a city that's made of stone, right? Nothing burns. Why are they out there doing that? And why are they out going to their bowling league? Because it's about building social capital, the bonds of trust between them. They trust each other, they trust their future, they trust their society. Robert Putnam wrote a book about America and commuting America, that people are no longer having strong bonds of social capital. And that's really pulling their communities apart, and it's largely through commuting, as it were. So guys that used to go bowling together are now bowling alone. So this whole notion of social capital as well has deep implications in communities that are very diverse. They found out that diversity may not, in fact, enhance social capital, it may diminish it. And if that's the case, we've got a real big problem in Toronto, because we're about the most diverse multicultural city on the planet. So at the foundation, we said, listen, we better look into this. We better do something about it. So I can see your eyes out there saying, wow, bowling alone, Putnam, social capital, how the heck are you going to sell this? And of course, you talk to donors and you say social capital, and it's what? So we had to build a narrative around it. We had to build a movement around it. And we went back to something very interesting, and that was the Pan Am Games. We said, can we use and catalyze the Pan Am Games to help build social capital in our communities? I said, why not? We didn't know how we're going to do it, but how can we do it? So Pan Am is going to build a great legacy of physical capital and sport legacy as well. But we said, you're going to build physical capital? How about a social capital legacy as well? So we went to talk to them about how do we use sport and play to build healthier, stronger, and better connected communities. And they said, we like the idea, the vision, but we don't get the strategy. How are you going to get there? So what do? We convene. So first we sit with our fund holders and we explain the big picture vision here. And this is where it helps to have very deep relationships with fund holders for a while, because they can understand youth, they can understand play, they can understand healthy activity, they can understand the concept of Pan Am, What they can't understand is how you're going to connect all the dots and make some sense out of this. So what's the first thing that we do is we don't try and do it on our own. We had convenings in Ajax, Toronto, and Hamilton. We had hundreds of people come together to help create something that they, not us, called Playing for Keeps. And if you haven't seen this yet, Google it. We've got a whole bunch of videos out there that'll make complete sense to you. But the notion was, how do we actually create healthier, better connected? Remember that earlier point I made about Jane Finch, where they didn't have the networks? Better connected and stronger communities through play. So we brought our fund holders along through this whole process of something called Playing for Keeps. So we went into our neighborhoods. We took our neighborhoods out in the suburbs. We took newcomers. We connected them with George Brown College, who would train them as ambassadors. We piloted them as trained volunteers for the 2012 Ontario Summer Games. To do what? To create neighborhood games. They literally go into their neighborhoods and they literally take people out and they play games to build social capital and to be healthy. We've got over 650 newcomers trained. 600 neighborhood games have taken place with over 20,000 participants in the City of Toronto. And these are largely newcomers in the inner suburbs. So let me give you a flavor of why this was such a big deal in terms of our fund holders in particular, who really wanted to know how do you put outcomes and measurements against something as esoteric as social capital. So I tell the story about a particular neighborhood game that took place in the west end of the city out by Hyde Park. If you can imagine out there, there's a ravine. And on one side of the ravine is a very affluent community of folks who've been here for a long time. On the other side of the ravine is a newcomer community largely made up of Bangladeshis. And as the story goes, the kids on both sides were told and knew you don't go over to the other side, right? We just keep apart a little bit. And it was never a problem, but they always knew those were the rules. Then there was a woman that got involved with us on neighborhood games who said, you know what? I want to do something to bring these communities together. So of all times, the middle of February, she decides to hold a neighborhood game. Her game was literally to have a snowman making contest. She brought people in from the Bangladeshi side of the community who did not have a clue how to build a snowman. So she taught them, where do you put the coal? Where do you stick the carrot? What do you do with the scarf? Where do you get branched? How do you make a snowman? So this snowman making contest, as they called it as a neighborhood game, was fundamentally transformational for both of those communities. Now they actually meet, the kids are going back and forth, it's not a big deal. But if anything, you've now created a pathway for a whole bunch of newcomers to experience of what it means to be Canadian, and above all, what it means to be Torontonian. And you can do this, and they did it through play. We've got the Ontario Trillium Foundation as one of our lead funders. Toronto Pearson has come on as a corporate lead on this. And we've got a lineup of fund holders who can see this as risky, but super innovative way of bringing communities together. So when I start thinking about some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of city building and philanthropy, a couple of takeaways, and we'll wrap it up and get into some questions, is really the recognition that this is philanthropy's moment now. Because there are issues in our communities, whether they're health-related, whether they're socially related, youth-related, gender-related, where people are saying that the government and the private sector alone can't solve these. Philanthropy has been a place that can actually bring those groups together. It can actually bring philanthropy into it. Why? Because we can be risky and we can be innovative in ways that others couldn't. Now, I'm going to make that point just a little firmer for you right now. Not too long ago, Dominic Barton, who's the CEO of McKinsey, and myself wrote a piece about tri-sector leadership. It's in the Globe and Mail. If you want to go online, you can find it there. But we made the argument of a special type of leadership that's going to be required going forward. We call it tri-sector leadership. But the fundamental underpinning of this is my firm belief about why this is philanthropy's moment. It goes like this. 10 or 15 years ago, if I would go to a bank president and I'd say, look, I really want to engage you in something like, let's say, call it the Toronto Sport Leadership Program. Say, Rahul, love you to bits, can't do it though, because my shareholders don't want that to happen. If you go into the government side, they say, listen, that's interesting, come back when it's been validated in 10 years, but we can't play there right now. What I did learn along the way, though, is that fundamentally something has shifted from there. It goes like this. In the philanthropic world, we've got at least two bottom lines for all of our business, right? We've got a financial bottom line, got to pay our staff, we've got to pay our bills, got to keep the lights on. But we also have a social mission bottom line. So when I talk to my board, they'll say, great, that's what the financials say, but what did we do with respect to our mission this year? Because that's what we're in business to do. So I have to be able to do that. When you look at the government and the public sector, for the longest time, they'd always have a financial bottom line. They'd have a social mission bottom line as well, whether it's immigration, education, or whatever the case may be. The corporate sector always had the financial bottom line, one. But as a result of things like corporate social responsibility, shared value, Michael Porter, it's now in the boardrooms and the MBA schools. They haven't said we've got another bottom line, but they're sure as heck thinking about it. This creates an alignment opportunity. And that alignment opportunity is far more profound than I think most of us really realize. It really creates an opportunity for philanthropy. So I say philanthropy's moment is now. And that moment, and actually capitalizing on that moment, is really through engagement. And if I had to leave you with one thought about the road to engagement is, it's not about the money. The money will follow. You need to create an engagement strategy that's going to actually provide purpose and pathway for philanthropy to really make some impact in city building. If you can show that, the money will come on its own. Okay? So I think what I'll do is I'll leave you there because I've thrown a whole bunch of themes out at you in so many different ways, and hopefully you got to know a little bit about your city that maybe you didn't know before. Maybe you'll love it a little bit more as well. Okay, so thanks for your time.
So they have this set up for us to sit here. I'm not sure if we sit there, if you'll actually be able to see us. Maybe we'll test it out quickly. Or we can stand. You stand there, maybe, and I'll sort of stand here and help moderate. Certainly, I expect there's a lot of questions that have come forward, and I want to start us off if I could do that. You talked about the City of Toronto being a laboratory, or I think you used the term a petri dish for globalization, and yet so many of the charities in this city and the country have not advanced in terms of building diversity into their organizations, I think particularly at the board and governance level. Why do you think that is, and what do you think we can do about that?
So I can see when I read the schedule that that's a theme throughout the conference. And I guess, you know, I've been a part of a number of conversations around this, and there are a number of things that go along with this. One is that the rapid change in Toronto, we've had roughly 25% of our population show up in the city over the last 30, 35 years. So the rapid change that we've seen, particularly in diversity, hasn't really been reflected yet through the leadership path. I think that's one thing. One of the other pieces, and this isn't such a pretty piece to have to say though, but 43% of Torontonians, 43% live in low or very low income neighborhoods. That's over 1 million people. 2/3 of them are visible minorities. So when you start to think about engaging people in philanthropy, unfortunately in this situation, you're still having a large proportion of our population in the city of Toronto as the beneficiaries of the philanthropy as opposed to the journey. Now that's not exclusively it, and that's going to change over time, and I think that's happening, but it's happening slowly. The other part that I realized quite a long time ago in terms of philanthropy in Toronto as it relates to this particular piece is there are a lot of communities who have had to support themselves while philanthropy writ large was dealing with the mainstream issues. And as a result of that, they have their own informal and formal networks of taking care of themselves, and they're still doing that. And I remember even the days of the United Way where folks were saying, you know, why should I support the United Way? How much money are they giving to the, you know, pick your community? And until you could actually demonstrate that, or in other words, demonstrate relevance to a particular community, it was going to be a challenge. So I think that's sort of looking in the rear view mirror. If we look forward, I think it's actually quite optimistic, because I think that there is a lot of leadership through volunteerism that people want to get involved with. So if people are looking to get more diverse individuals in their groups, you know, through your committees, et cetera, there are people lining up for opportunities for that and for boards. And I think there's a certain maturation and ownership that's being taken place in diverse communities, that they're fundamentally engaging with Toronto differently, more ownership now. So I think that this is the right discussion to be having at the right time. And my sense is, within the next 10 years, you're going to find out that this is going to be a very different flavor.
Has anyone had experience in that regard in terms of working with your own organizations and your own boards or other charities that have really, I think, embraced and moved forward and had some success in building diversity into their organizations right through, not just as beneficiaries, but obviously through the governance structure? Anyone had success in that or had any steps forward? Yep.
So,
can I ask a question?
Absolutely, of course.
I'm really interested in the leadership here and how in a complex city like Toronto you get that clarity of purpose. Because I know in London we really struggled to get lots of the charity sector to agree on what the priorities were. So, for example, you talked about a relationship with the United Way. In London, the equivalent of the United Way would fight with the equivalent of the Community Foundation about whether it should be homelessness or whether it should be youth unemployment. How do you get that clarity? I'd be really interested.
So I don't want to overstate the clarity to start off with, because it's all very gray areas as well. But interestingly enough, a couple of days ago, so last week, we held something called the Community Knowledge Exchange Summit, big title, over at TIFF just down the street, where we had people from around the country and around the globe coming to talk about how do we use community knowledge writ large, how do we align around the priorities there, and how do we actually measure it? And one of the things is not to look for the grand unified theory. That one of the beauties of our Vital Signs report, and I encourage you to have a look at it, is we've got 10 key issue areas. And those issue areas are priorities in and of themselves. So it's not like, and actually the real mature narrative that comes out of those 10 issue areas is how integrated they are. So in some cases, people say, well, listen, let's just all get behind homelessness and let's go eradicate it in 5 years. Well, truthfully, that's not going to happen, in 5 or 50 years, but don't do it at the expense of greening. Don't do it at the expense of, child poverty. Don't do it at the expense of youth unemployment. All of these things are actually quite integrated. And I think that probably one of the better parts of achieving what level of clarity that we've got now is that when we can collaborate more broadly. So you don't all have to get into the same bucket at the same time.
Yep, Nancy.
Just on that point of collaboration, as part of this Vital City report, but also as part of living in Toronto, do you see that collaboration amongst charities is really going to be the future in getting at the root of some of those problems? Are too many of us trying to do the same thing? Or, will we be more successful working together? And
Right.
Comments on that?
Right. So I've said before in my speeches that, competition may have built our cities, but collaboration is the way forward. It absolutely has to be there. Now, I think we're actually pretty good as collaborators. I think people work together quite well. I think as Canadians, we have a certain DNA that kind of gets us working together a little bit better as well. And I also, I push back against those who say there are too many charities doing the same thing, because they're not all doing the same thing. They may be doing variations of that. We don't complain when we have all these scientists that are doing the same thing as well. So it really matters on what you're doing, how good you're at it, and whether you can demonstrate impact. And if you can, that's great. And I think that if we've got a host of organizations that are working in their own space on a particular issue, but they come together to collaborate and learn and all get better at what they're doing, I think that's actually a very good thing.
You spoke briefly about the Toronto model of philanthropy.
Yep.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about
Sure. So this actually came out of my little trip down to Miami. So bless their souls, last February, they phoned me up and said, we've got a board meeting in Miami. Would you come down? I said, yeah, I'll be there. And it was a board meeting, and I took them through vital signs and the model. And what they found very helpful was, it was this notion of strategic philanthropy. So the concept was that there was a fact base to be working off of. So for us, it's vital signs. And if you haven't been on our website yet, I encourage you to go look at the other side of it, which is our solution set, which we call our Community Knowledge Center. Think YouTube for philanthropy. It's all laid out under vital signs. There's solutions, videos, storytelling from different charities, not our voice, but it's their voice. So what that did was, instead of saying, here's a big cause, let's go get a bunch of money and throw it at that, what we had was a very dynamic narrative about a very dynamic city. And that was the knowledge base where everything started. Then what we did is we worked on a solution set that we could actually demonstrate were impacting the issues raised in the report. So now we actually had diagnostic and solutions. And then we would bring donors or fund holders or funders or government or the private sector, whatever, to the table to say, great, here are solutions here. How do you want to work with that? So they could fund them, they could actually use human capital, they could capacity build, whatever they want, but they could see diagnostic solutions. You figure out how you want to support it. And then we'd go offline with them, as I told you about a bunch of the stories already, sport leadership, playing for keeps, where we could actually go into a space where when you had people working in this Toronto model, we kind of call them over and say, you think that's cool? We got this space called risk and innovation. You're feeling really risky? You want to do something innovative? Sure. So they'll give half their money into the solution set and say, I want half my money to go into this really neat innovation space. Let's go try something new. So that's broadly what we call the art of wise giving. It's strategic philanthropy.
Was it difficult with the vital signs? I mean, that's I think, an incredible example and demonstration of impact. And I think a lot of charities really struggle at how do they define impact. They can talk about what they do and why it matters, but the impact of dollars that are contributed sometimes can be more difficult to demonstrate. And obviously that's a tangible example. And as you just sort of said, you know, getting to that solutions point. Any thoughts or perspective that you have on how charities are doing at demonstrating the impact of dollars at work?
Sure. So I just want to go back to the Community Knowledge Exchange Summit. Go online to ckx.org. There's a ton of stuff. We were just talking about this issue for 2.5 days last week. So on the whole notion of measurement, really good idea to turn your mind to it. And it could be qualitative, it could be quantitative, but you should at the very least have a theory of change that you can explain why you're doing what you're doing the way you're doing it. And if you can do that, you should be able to tell stories that amplify it and also explain what are the results from what you do. Sometimes you get some nice crisp measurements, sometimes you don't. And qualitative ones are okay as well. But I think going forward, the accountability that philanthropists are asking for, the more quantitative you can make it, the better. But as I also push back to many of our philanthropists, I would also say that don't stop doing things just because you can't measure it. That's the biggest risk of measurement, is that we're going to go chase shiny objects that are going to be nice and quantifiable, but we're going to miss the really big things that, you know what? We're not going to know if they work for 25 years. This Toronto Sport Leadership Program, as soon as I say, boy, 1,000 graduates, everybody's happy. But you know what? The real payback's going to be in 40 years when their kids now are part of a family that had a healthy tradition, that had a healthy connection with the city, that now all of the good things start happening. And I couldn't even begin to start to quantify that. So measurement's a toughie. But you've got some great stories and you're really good at storytelling. So qualitative and quantitative mix is really important.
So you talked about a couple of areas that, you know, focus like diminished sense of belonging and poverty of opportunity. And we know that donors a lot of the time will give to something that they've had personal experience with. So when you're talking to people who have no personal experience with that, how do you engage them and really introduce it to them beyond statistics or beyond, you know, what might happen if we take this risk? Like, how do you actually do the engagement?
Right. So that's a journey. So not every donor is ready for that journey, and not every donor is open to that journey. But I would say that even the toughest fund holders that we had that came in that say, nope, we're doing this, and that's all we care about. Over time, they start to realize that, you know what, it's really neat to get engaged in areas that you may not have a particular connection with right away. Or you maybe get engaged to the narrative around vital signs and it wakes you up to aspects of your own life. So you may suddenly say, gee, look at my kids. You know, my kids aren't, youth unemployment's not an issue with them, or not, but it doesn't matter. And then you start to realize just how fortunate your kids are going to the school they're at, the opportunities they have. And you start to realize, gee whiz, if I could begin to provide opportunities like that for other kids, and I realize how important it is, maybe I want to go dip my toe in that water. And they start to dip their toe in, and they can expand in any direction they want. But it's a long-term, very patient, it's patient capital discussion. And connecting that head and the heart just takes a while. It takes a while. But our sector is really good at storytelling. I mean, we can get better at it, but this is how we're used to communicating, right? That you know, the annual report, right? We jam all the names in there, put all the financial statements, but the real tough work is how do we grab the hearts of the people that we need to open up to what our missions are.
It's true that I think donors were more caring about issues, not organizations. It's not enough to just be a good organization with a good reputation. You know, there's lots of organizations that sort of fit that bill. It is a question of sort of finding those issues and who's going to help you deliver on that solution. What are the red flags that either the Toronto Foundation or your donors, when they're considering making an investment or establishing an endowment fund that will support something that they believe in, what are the red flags that are kind of popping up that are causing, you know, charities to perhaps not be top of the list?
Right. So, you know, in our space, reputational risk is enormous, right? So if you don't have a squeaky clean reputation, you know, it will get out there. I would say that governance is also probably bigger now than it has been for a long time. I would also say that your financial statements, if they reflect constant deficits, not ideal, but you better have a good story as to why, because it's not the worst thing in the world, by the way. You just need sophisticated donors to really understand why that's the case. And having, once again, a really good narrative about why you exist, what's your theory of change, and why do you do what you do, and why it's important, and the outcomes there. You know, other than that, for the most part, you know, if you treat people well, my experience has been that, you know, most of the ones that I've been meeting are quite open to it. But there are some donors who, for whatever reason, it's not a priority for them right now. It might be a priority in another day. There are also some other organizations out there that are doing kind of rating of organizations as well. And that's kind of a dangerous space in some respects as well. And my experience has been those folks that are doing the analysis don't always read financial statements quite the right way. You know, fund accounting is not the easiest thing if you don't live and breathe it all over the place either. So, you know, there's a little bit of a pressure in the marketplace around that. So sometimes I guess the real red flag is when you're meeting a donor, know the perspective that your donor is bringing to the table. Are they sophisticated? Have they done a ton of research or not? What are their priorities? What do they want to start the discussion around? Don't be totally on, you know, just do the kitchen sink piece and get it out on the table. There's a lot of listening that's got to go on in the beginning.
I'm interested if anyone in the room feels that their organization has done a good job at demonstrating impact. You know, whether they've done something innovative to help their donors see and feel the impact of the gifts that they've given. Any examples that you might have from your experience, or is this an area that some of you feel, you know, you're not perhaps as solid at it as you'd like to be? Comments? Yep.
Simply, we have an awards dinner where our donors meet our students, and it may seem pretty simple, but it's transformational for both the students and the donors. And it's just the donors have an opportunity to see how the students are benefiting from their generosity.
Good example.
Can I just build on that little human touch
Yeah.
one here? As you said that, it reminded me of our Toronto Sport Leadership. The first time I went into a graduation ceremony, I've got to paint this picture for you because it was transformational for some donors who are a little bit on the edge. It was one of the first events I went to, and all the young people will come up. It's a graduation, you shake their hand. All the guys kind of walk up like this, you shake their hand, they look up again. It's just, you've got to see it to believe it. There was a young woman who wanted to say some words to the audience because they come up, they announce themselves. She said, "Can I talk to the audience?" I thought, okay, you know, you hand over the mic, you never know what you're going to get. And it was one of those moments. She was clearly a challenged young woman of ethnicity who said, "I'm 16 years old and the mother of a 2-year-old boy," who was running around at the back. And went on then to say how she took this program, she learned how to be a better mother, get to school on time, and a laundry list of things. But then she threw it right back at us and said, "But you taught me nothing about leadership." And I think we all smiled because she was expecting this massive reprogramming of this person, and she thought that was going to be out of lack of respect. But it was quite the opposite. She learned everything that she should have in that context, and hopefully I think her child and her will have a better life. But the donors in the room, when they saw that moment and put those pieces together, they were there and they saw it and they felt it, they got it. No amount of speech making, storytelling, or whatever makes up for putting them in that space so they can understand it.
Perfect. There's a comment to hear.
Just that more and more we're understanding in the social service field that it's not just one charity that contributes, it's a collective impact. So working with other charities, other private sectors to figure out which bit you can measure or quantify, and add it to others and make the whole story, because it's not just one.
Right.
It's a collective that creates the impact. So trying to measure collectively, it's huge.
It is. And on that point, when you get a chance to look at this report, you'll see there's the report and then there are wraparound stories of other organizations. And that's precisely to your point of collective impact. Right? This is how we mutually supported each other to create the environment and the capacity to do all of those things.
So the social service sector, obviously there's a lot of examples in the report about some of the great organizations, and you've mentioned a few projects. How do you think the sort of bigger traditional charities out there, are they adapting enough to be as sort of tangible in terms of providing value? I'm thinking about some of the big national NGOs that perhaps are perhaps maybe a little out of touch with, you know, what the specifics of practical program implementation, like some of the ones you've mentioned. Any comments you might have on that?
No, that's a good question. I think attention span in general is probably the biggest threat to that, because now, you know, you've got technology disrupting the transactional part of this. So, you know, the Kiva.orgs, et cetera, you know, people are able to, you know, different intermediary groups, different experiences with giving. So it's a different type of relationship now. I think we're actually blessed in this country to have, you know, large, you know, nationally based organizations and strong arms of internationally based ones here. But let me just go off on a side for a second. Anybody from U of T here? Okay, there you go. Okay, so U of T is a really neat example as well. My alma mater, so it's going to be all good things about U of T. But, you know, the ability here of a large university with $1 billion campaign, so that's a huge number to put out there. Is it 2? Oh, but sorry, God, I'm behind the times. Wow, I've got to call David. That's a good move. But their ability to go across the country and actually say to people that for Canada to succeed, you need U of T to succeed. And this is what it's going to take. And to build that belief and that narrative, that's not going to work with everybody, but you certainly need it to create that brand around all of that journey, to get alumni engaged in something, and to get those with enormous capacities to kickstart things like that to get involved. So it's all about building that story.
Any other sort of thoughts that folks might have about either big traditional organizations and that concept of demonstrating impact? I do think that, you know, again, donors are interested in those tangible kinds of programs that they can go out and see and feel and touch. But I think some of the larger organizations are being very challenged, and perhaps, you know, having a look at everything from, are they too bureaucratic? Are they nimble enough, you know, to be able to encourage the new generation of philanthropists to get involved? And you touched on social media, and I'm interested in your thoughts about how, you know, impact statements like vital signs, how are you using social media to get people in the City of Toronto to really understand, I think, some of the significant progress that's been made in a lot of the areas you touched on?
There's a lot of legwork there because this is, the fourth largest media market in North America. It's a tough place to get your story out there, and we're all trying to get our stories out there. So, obviously we're out speaking about this quite a bit. We've got relationships. Our social media is also pushing this out. And I would say that, we're focused. We're focused on vital signs, we're focused on our business model, and we just go back to it again and again. Now, when we started this whole discussion around the Toronto model and what the elements are, people's eyes would roll back. They just didn't get it. It took time. It took 3 years in before this really started to gain some traction. But I think it's committing to a strategy and believing in it and looking at the assets that you've got and try to differentiate yourself from others. To the earlier point at the back about, are we doing the same thing? You might be all doing similar things, but there's something about what you're doing that's differentiated from others. If you don't know what that is, I strongly recommend you find that out, because that's probably the most important thing that you're going to be doing in any day, is trying to differentiate yourself from others.
It's an expensive time to raise money because a lot of charities are still, need to rely and focus on the traditional methods, whether that's direct mail or even special events, et cetera, but also needing to invest in newer ways of engaging and stewarding donors. Is that something that, from the Toronto Foundation's perspective and the organizations that you work with, are you finding that issue of cost of fundraising in this city to matter, or
Right.
is it something that's sort of elsewhere?
So we're very cautious about, our costs, and we're in a really good space for this. But I think the more challenging part is probably donor fatigue. Because the more sophisticated we get, the more systems get sophisticated, the more our band of donors or potential donors and prospects are being approached by multiple times, right? And one of the advantages for working with the Toronto Foundation is you can kind of put your foundation together and then sort of decide where you're going to go. And we make a big effort, by the way, to connect all of your groups into our donors through this space. So the idea is not that we try to put a wall up, it's quite the opposite. But one of the things that we hear time and time again is the general donor fatigue. Now there's a couple of ways of looking at that. One is just, the annoyance on a personal level of getting multiple calls on anything. Like, nobody wants to pick up the phone anymore, right? It's just life. And the other part of it, though, is people don't like to say no, especially around their really good causes. So people, we here, tend to feel a little stressed about having to do that. So it's quite the challenge on a certain level for us to all become extremely technically proficient and professional and being able to narrow our focus and then all go after the same people on the same basis as that. So I would think that's a challenge. Luckily, we're not in a small town, we're in a very big city, and there are lots of opportunities to engage people, and those with philanthropic capacity can spread it quite widely.
How many of you work for charities that really are focused predominantly on the City of Toronto marketplace in terms of either, okay. And what's the fundraising climate out there? What are you seeing? What are you experiencing? Are you finding that the people of Toronto are more generous? Are they asking more questions? What are you finding to be some of the unique changes that perhaps you've seen in working with donors and community members in Toronto itself? Yeah?
They're not afraid to transition their values. So they're growing as donors, and they don't have to stay with the same cause.
Interesting.
They grow depending on their interests.
Yeah.
Usually the age of the kids.
Yeah, interesting. I think that, you could say that our donors are becoming more fickle. I actually think it's the opposite. I think it comes to your point that they're becoming more sort of deliberate in terms of looking for the causes that they want to invest in. And if it's not this charity that I loved and supported for many, many years, it's this one that's going to provide the solution. I'm going to make my contribution there. So really that sort of impact-based philanthropy. Other examples or comments that you might have about what you're experiencing in the Toronto marketplace from either philanthropic perspective or even your program delivery side of things. Comments?
You don't look like a shy group.
I'll ask another question.
Sure.
So I'm actually from Winnipeg and moved to Toronto 8 years ago. And I remember the folks out west giving me a bad time about moving to the City of Toronto. The big smoke, the big city. Why would you want to go and live in a concrete postage stamp? And when I moved to Winnipeg and to Toronto, I take great pride in the fact that I actually have found living in this city to be incredibly friendly, incredibly open. I have met some of the most amazing people both in my community and through my work. But there is a perspective outside of the City of Toronto that we are not a generous and giving community. Maybe that doesn't matter, maybe we don't care what people think outside of the city, but I'm interested in your comments about how when you travel and connect with colleagues, are people aware of some of the impact of what's actually happening in the city, or are we only focusing on the downside?
Right. So I'll say with a big smile on my face, when I go to New York and I'm talking up there about Toronto's vital signs, they always wonder, what's this guy from Toronto doing up here? So I like to say to them, you know the difference between New Yorkers and Toronto and Torontonians, right? They're way friendlier. We're just way nicer. And they get it, right? Because when you come here, there's something about the way we do things in Toronto that's just really different. Not usually I said about Americans and Canadians, but it creates a different platform for us to look at both our good and our not so good here. So if you read vital signs, I hope you'll take away that we bend over backwards to make sure we celebrate the things that we're doing well in this city, because we need to do more of it. We need to support each other to say, guess what, when you put your shoulders behind things, we can make a difference, and we can create this fourth most livable city on the planet. It doesn't happen on its own. It's deliberate. You can do it, and we can work towards it. But on the other side, you've got to look at the situation where you say, not enough people are living in the fourth most livable city on the planet, and we can't be naive enough to think that that's sustainable either. And that's the typical Canadian, well, what are you going to do about it? Right in the middle of the road. But there are issues that we've looked at in the city over years where we have been in the middle of the road, but we've actually finally taken a step in that direction and done something about it. Which I think is really the empowering part of vital signs. Get informed, get engaged, and you can make a difference. And I tell you, it's every year, I give the vital signs talk, and people sort of meet you, during the year, and they'll tell you what they remembered about it. And the one that came back the most last year, which was a huge surprise, was this old Lily Tomlin line. Does everybody remember Lily Tomlin? The American comedian, right? It was great. So she once said, I used to say to myself, why doesn't somebody do something about that? And then I realized I was a somebody. And this was a part of a talk that I'd given to really talk about the importance of being informed and in getting engaged. I mean, it doesn't mean it's all getting pushed back on the individual, but we're a very powerful group of individuals when we work together collectively and taking responsibility. And like the lady who did the snowman making contest, she didn't try to change the world. She just wanted to change her street and her community, but it was transformational. So that capability is there. And we need to celebrate more of that, because a lot of what's good in this city has actually come about as a result of that.
Oh, here we go.
And from Peterborough, Trent University, I was on the founding board for the Community Foundation there. We've been going for about 5 years now. Donors are getting very impatient, and they want to see the result of their funds and outcomes in a shorter period of time. Yet a lot of the work we have to do at the Community Foundation at the moment is gather information, interpret, develop these partnerships, bring collaborations together. I'm just wondering how your experience as a mature community foundation, how you have attracted donors to fund the work of vital signs and the really key preparatory work that allows you then to have much more targeted asks for programs later on.
Got it. And just to say, Bill Lockington is a very valued member of our board at the national level. So the question is how do you really get people to buy into the long-term things often? And from our perspective is don't make it an all or nothing. So when we have fund holders that we're talking to them about this journey of philanthropy, and we really do emphasize it's a journey, and we're not saying do it all with us. What we're saying is, as you think about your giving, you're going to have some immediate things that you want to take care of in their commitments. You go ahead and do that. Then think of it like a portfolio. You're going to have some of those things in the medium to short term that you're going to want to address. And there are organizations out there that are happy to connect you with that you probably need to be talking about. But when you think about the long-term part of your portfolio, that's in our sweet spot, and that's how we can talk about it. And we don't try to be anything that we're not. So back to the earlier point, if we stay focused on where we think that we can add the most value.
Barbara and then Nancy.
I'm sort of trying to make sense of this. With the new Regent Park, is it answering or responding to some of the needs that are expressed through vital signs, and you think in the 20 years when it's all done, it will be a success?
Yeah, I think it's already a success from a number of perspectives. They're having challenges, but that's a normal part of all of it. First of all, it was risky, it was innovative, and it brought a lot of different parties together. We're funding everything from music schools to, we've got youth programs, pathways. You know, we've been doing a lot of work in that space, and not just us. I mean, tons of people have been working in that space as well. But I think the important symbol of Regent Park was, it was yesterday. And now I think people realize that you can innovate and you can actually go in and rebuild communities. So I think it's going to be better in 25 years. It doesn't mean it's going to be a straight line to the top. There are going to be some learning curves along the way too, but it's going to be better than where they were before for sure.
Nancy, and then we'll come to Mark.
When you think about the work that you've done traveling to other cities, are there one or two takeaways or things that other cities do really well that we could do better in Toronto?
Yeah, lots of things. You know, I was in Rome in the summertime with my son, and at one point he had the zinger of the trip. He said, "Dad, like this city's a couple thousand years old, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "How come their transit system's better than ours?" You know, so you know there are places like that that just jump out at you. The gentleman from London, I'm London-born, by the way, London, England, then London, Ontario. When I think about how a lot of the work that's being done in central London, when I think about along the riverside and the bank, and they're doing some great stuff. They're bringing community out. They've got a climate that's a little bit more conducive than ours, but we could be a whole lot better at public space, and that becomes a cultural piece. Remember the story I told you about what happens down at the beach between sort of the Freedom 55 and the Bollywood Hollywood? That's the part that just reminds me that the Freedom 55 group still doesn't appreciate the public space in Toronto nearly as much as the newcomers do, that look around and go, wow, there's nobody on this beach. It's totally clean water. Let's have a great time. So I think we can do a lot better in public space than many others. But I think the biggest piece that I take away, though, is how culturally decent we are with each other. That either it's through history or it's because we've become this petri dish for the globe, and how we've done that. That I think we can be very optimistic about our future, because when I'm actually asked to go to other international cities and to bring the Toronto story there, it's because they're struggling with, you know, partisanship, hyper-partisanship, historical issues they can't get over, or problems that become so endemic they can't see a way out. So if anything, you know, we still have great cause to be very optimistic about our city. I can't say that's the case for a lot of other places. They're searching for that optimism.
Mark.
This comes perhaps to the more long-term impact again, but I used to have an assistant who worked for me, and she was from Laos, and she would give her token contribution to our charity, which was breast cancer. And she and her family would pool their money together, and they would send thousands of dollars back to Laos every couple of times a year, and they'd build a school or something. And she said to me that the impact was so much more clearer to her and her family by doing that than to giving to a charity which funds long-term research. How do we get companies or charities to change that dynamic? Because I've noticed in your report here, I love it, that even the informed part, your statistics part, is done in storytelling. And then there are stories there. How do we get charities to turn that corner?
Yeah. You know, I wish there was an easy answer to that. You know, it's like trying to change people's minds. You know, it's really tough. Usually you get to the mind from the heart. So if there's a way to help them see another perspective and connect the head and the heart, I think you're in great shape. You know, back to the diversity point raised a little bit earlier, you know, this is a big issue in sort of ethnic or diversity philanthropy as well, that a lot of money is going back home still, because back home is still only a generation away, and they can make enormous impact, and it's very near and dear to them. So how do we turn sort of renters into owners, as it were, so they feel that they've got some real stake in the future of the city and their country? And as that will happen over time, I have no doubt that more of their assets will stay here because they'll be needed here. But we still have to get better in the storytelling, though. But you're asking the right questions, you know, for sure.
You've done a great job. I love the two keywords that you use. which was informed and engaged. I think those are two really important words that have stuck out in the presentation.
Right.
Yep.
I just have a quick question, more on the vital signs. So you've mentioned a couple times that Toronto's the fourth livable city in the world, but you've also identified problems with youth underemployment and the housing epidemic with affordable housing. Now, those seem really big concerns whenever it comes to livable cities. How can youth afford to work and pay high rent? So I'm wondering if that, comparatively, are we doing well in those areas with cities of similar size, or is this really are there other factors that are contributing to that livable city statistic?
Sure.
It seems off.
Absolutely, it's supposed to seem off.
Yeah.
You've got it. And that's the whole point really about this, is that not enough people are living in that fourth most livable city on the planet. And the other big claim, and that's why it's urgency, that's why it's the bat signal. If we don't deal with these things, such as affordable housing, transit, which is more than just about getting back and forth places, when we have youth unemployment, things like that, we are not going to be the fourth most livable city on the planet. It's all relative, and we're in really good shape in a lot of respects, but it's just simply not sustainable.
Yeah. So comparatively, so you have compared Toronto to Chicago.
Yep.
How do we compare to them in terms of our unemployment rates? Are we on par? Are we better? Are we worse?
Sure. Totally depends on the city you're looking at. So if we're looking at housing affordability, we're severely unaffordable, but we're better than Hong Kong, we're better than Vancouver. If you're looking at things like Chicago, we talked about the crime statistic, obviously there's an enormous gap between there. And it really depends on when you are. If you start to look at the European capitals that you'd all love to go spend time in on a holiday, they've got ridiculously high youth unemployment compared to ours. I think some places in Spain, if I'm not mistaken, are up to 60% now. I mean, these are like 60%. That's insane. But they've got a great quality of life for those who've got jobs and they've got some sense of security, and we still want to go visit it.
We're coming up on our time. We've got time for one more question here. We'll take that, and then we'll close ourselves out.
I noticed in the data income inequality is one of your things that you monitor as well, and like in many places in the world, it's going in the wrong direction. It's getting more distinct. What strategy? How do you deal with that from a philanthropy level? In that you're getting more very rich people and more absolute poverty.
It's probably one of the most profound questions that we're trying to deal with right now. And if I try to bring this all together for a second around this one is, we've gotten really good at creating wealth, not so good at creating jobs. In fact, we reward creating wealth if you don't create jobs, because jobs are actually a drain on that in some respects. So there's a bit of a this enormous disconnect that it's not just Toronto and it's not just Western civilization or globalization. It's, last year when I did Vital Signs, the theme was we have to reboot the logic. So that gets really deep into this. This is when we have to start looking at things very, very differently. This is when we start looking at, forget about youth internment programs, but we start looking at a fundamentally different relationship between the public sector, funding of education, and private sector, a la Germany perhaps. Or variations on that theme. But this is the big one, that philanthropy is best chance at really advancing something is to be the space of risk and innovation, where the public sector can actually go and innovate, because they can't do it in their own space. They're accountable on a different level. And where the private sector, who's got their financial bottom line as their key element, but they can actually partner up with philanthropy to innovate around that space. So that's why I keep going back to the risk and innovation space.